network, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, Dawn, held its second inter-regional meeting from the 6th to the 11th of May 1990 in Niterói, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. From the 50s on, global economic processes have affected the position of women in different societies throughout the world. The UN conference, held in Mexico City in 1975, was inspired by the need to evaluate these effects and design corrective strategies. In order to provide a framework of analysis to further understand their situation and the implications of development strategies on the lives of both women and men, Third World female researchers and activists created Dawn as a space for sharing and systematizing their views.
Living in, let us say, one of these countries, developing countries, and working in development research, you're all the time seeing the impact of policies on people, and I was looking especially at the poor and women. And when I had an opportunity to see through reading the impact of similar development policies in other countries, developing countries, I was impressed to see how similar it was.
We should have a wider frame because the problems that we were feeling here were also felt in different places. And so at that point in time, I had this idea, suppose we get third world representations.
The idea then was really to bring third world women together and to try to focus on what had been the collective experience of women in the third world in the last 10 years of the decade for women, and to bring an analysis of our experience to the Nairobi Forum, which is being held in 1985.
Like in the Philippines, when the planning meeting was held, at that time they had a crisis, but no one was talking about the women's perspective to the debt crisis or to the whole development crisis. They were all scattered. The women's groups were concentrated in the health issue, in the battered women's centers, in the credit programs, but no one took an overall holistic view of what was in fact the symptoms. I mean, they were addressing the symptoms, but they did not actually understand what was happening to their society from the perspective of women.
And at Nairobi also we organized lots of impromptu sessions with socialist women, with women concerned with reproductive rights, with a number of issues which were going around there but which were not particularly part of the official agenda.
Following Nairobi, we then launched a program of research in which we were focusing on, first of all, the crisis, and then on women's organizations.
Our first outing was really the hosting of a steering committee meeting of Dawn, and all members of Dawn came to Ibadan and to talk about the crisis, but really to hold a meeting to discuss with us. And it was at that point that I got co-opted onto the steering committee.
And I think that Dawn was very, very effective in the sense that it became a third world women's network. It allowed South-South women to come together, and it was the first time that something like this had happened.
I wanted to say one more thing, which is, in my opinion, the message which I have learned, and that is intergovernmental meetings, even of South-South, including North-South, are really totally incapable of delivering any change. To my mind, it is the South-South cooperation with the movements, the environmental movement, the women's movement. We are much more fluid, you see, we are much less troubled by our country's political posture. Mm-hmm. So it gives us much more freedom.
The meeting in Niterói brought together a group of approximately 100 women from 30 different countries. Among them were researchers, activists, and policymakers. The purpose was to assess the work of the past years, which has mainly focused on research. The results of specific studies were presented. They focus on major themes such as food and energy, the debt crisis and its effects on women's lives, and the women's movement and its visions. Emphasis was given on how to use academic studies in the political action launched by women's organizations.
Research has to be converted into action. Research has to be converted into training. Now, you can do it at one level, at the policy formulation level, because at that level, it obviously would touch and reach a larger group of people. But it's not always very easy because you have to work with bureaucracies, you have to work with interest groups, you have to work with the whole political structure. Another way is actually to bring it to the, as you say, the grassroots. But it's not just us who brings it to the grassroots. It's not as though we are the enlightened people who then bring this light there. It is a feedback process whereby you involve your participants or the people who have given you this information into this whole process of creating and defining and checking to see whether your analysis makes sense.
La investigación ha jugado un papel importantísimo en Nicaragua porque ha permitido denunciar.
Research played a very important role in Nicaragua because it permitted the denouncement of a series of problems that had previously been hidden. For example, a study that was done about the domestic mistreatment of women enabled the discussion to be elevated to a national level on a theme that is considered private, individual, and it also gave us the possibility to influence government policy about the police so that, for example, the legal system could deal with this type of case.
2 years later, when the research was completed, it was the first time that they had anything that was analyzed along the lines of gender. And how was that used? The feminist group, the feminist movement immediately made that into a tool.
Besides research and advocacy, international relations, training, documentation and communication are also part of Dawn's activities. Communication strategies were underlined as an important tool to enable the maximum links between these different levels: research, the women's movement and the public in general.
We were present at the very first Dawn meeting, which was held in Bangalore in 1984, where one of the issues that was discussed quite importantly was this business of the communications input into Dawn's activities.
Eu tive a oportunidade de ver que as mulheres veem a comunicação como uma possibilidade de encontrar saídas para a crise. Então, o que a gente vê é elas aproveitando todos os espaços possíveis. Então, a gente tem desde espaços mais
Women see communication as a possible way out of the crisis. They try all possible means through more formal channels like well-known radio programs, where through the personal commitment of people who work there, they manage to introduce the question of women, or through more informal groups that search for any means to communicate, like bulletins or any other channel to get the message across.
We look at global issues like different birth control methods and how it affects us, so various issues, and we do it in theater, where we put on an annual production. We use different techniques like our music, our dance. We use symbols. We hardly use props or set. We use our bodies to make different sounds. We use mime a lot. And then in the workshops, we invite the women to come and then we talk. And then we do research informally through oral testimonies again.
It's actually very encouraging to see 6 years later that it's not just fledgling publishers, which is what we were in 1984, but there are film people, there are theatre people, there are audiovisual people present at this Dawn meeting.
Dawn has identified and addressed the similarities between women's conditions in the various regions of the planet. The reflections developed in the Rio meeting indicate that the perception of and balance between diversity and commonalities are changing.
Africa is a very large region. We have communication problems and also serious communication problems, even posting letters, getting in touch with one another. And then we have the various units, blocks of Africa, east, west, north, south. Then linguistic blocks, the francophones, the anglophones, and the lusophones, and these are various groups speaking different languages whom you have to bring together into one.
I think all of us hesitate to speak for India because conditions in the country are so vastly different from one part of the country to the other, between the different classes, between the different castes, and between the different groups that exist, religious groups, ethnic groups, that it's very, very difficult to speak of India as one homogeneous place.
In terms of media visualization of the so-called first world, you have a concept of an African woman who is overburdened, carrying a pot, pregnant, holding a child with a hoe in her hand. These are the visual media projection you get on Africa. We in Africa, in the feminist movement, reject this notion also because we feel we may be poor, but we are not powerless. And our power comes from the cultural identity.
I think what probably separates South Asia from Africa is the fact that its independence, its move away from colonialism was based on a divisiveness rather than on any unifying factors. There were divisiveness based on religion, on class, on ethnic complexities, on caste, and so forth. Again, we find in South Asia there is a feeling that cultural context, if we draw too much upon the cultural context, it tends to confine us rather than liberate us. I don't know whether this is because we restrict our cultural context to our own association with the our colonizing experience, and whether we don't go beyond that.
Those two in particular, the class and ethnic divisions among women, have been a major problems for creating a solid, cohesive movement. One of the things that we see as very important is to strengthen the existing organizations and networks and to create linkages between them.
Uno de los factores que ha afectado grandemente a la mujer.
I would first like to mention that one of the factors that has greatly affected women is the displacement from her place of origin. Entire communities have had to move to the city or to the neighboring countryside of Honduras because of the repression. Secondly, it's women that have to assume the leadership of the household. Why? Because men are either incorporated into the army or into the guerrillas, or because many have been killed. Others have left the country, so women have had to become the head of the family out of necessity.
It seems to me we need to sort of reflect on what the women's movement is. Is it one movement? Does it consist of several movements? Just as Peggy was talking about the nature of the women's movement, if we call it that, in the Caribbean, my own reflections on the women's movement in the Pacific, it's really not a uniform sort of situation. There are many women's groups, organizations. In fact, the dominant pattern, as Olandina was pointing out, is really one of very conservative, reactionary women's groups which provide a sort of support for the status quo, for the whole sort of patriarchal systems which continue to exist in our region. There's only a fragment of that movement really is progressive and which seeks to challenge existing structures and the existing society and the ideologies on which it's founded.
In Argentina, 70% people are living say in urban areas, and while in India, 70% of population is living in the rural area. So some of the things which are our concerns are not really concerns for the Argentinian people.
The only thing I would say is that since the question of development or liberation has been raised, it's something that I think we have all been thinking about and discussing, because you might get in India or in any of our countries, I suspect, conditions which would say count as developed conditions. You might get a place or an area which is fully industrialized, which has got all the modern amenities, which has schooling and all of those things, and yet will continue to kill its women, will continue to oppress its women for many reasons. I no longer know what development means, and I no longer know how to apply it to our societies.
Quite a few are now looking for the social democratic countries in Scandinavia as models for development. I'm from such a regime and democratic country. I think then we should really come together in these countries in a direct dialogue with you to assess what has been happening in terms of gender relations in this country during these decades of economic growth.
See, one of the things that in 1984, when a bunch of us got together and sort of had this brainwave of an idea that we could do something like this, was that we were really impressed by how much commonality there was between us as women coming from different parts of the third world. If you ask me now, what I'm really struck by enormously is the amount of differences that there are. Really, the differences between the regions in terms of the world economy and in terms of the way the world economy has shaped regional economies and the way regional economies fit into the world economy is so widely different that if we don't take that into account in terms of strategies we devise, or even in terms of identification of priorities, identification of needs, then really we will be doing ourselves and the women of our regions a great injustice.
In spite of the differences, we are exposed to the same experiences. I think one could overplay the differences, and I think sometimes that overplay could be political.
If awareness of diversity has been sharpened by the efforts of Dawn since its creation, there still remains the evidence that throughout the world, women were directly affected by the economic crisis of the 80s.
I think one of the best documented part would be in South Asia, which shows very clearly that development has been very anti-women throughout the 20th century in the whole South Asia region. That it's been, it's reduced women's chances of survival. It is relative to men. It has reduced their scope of education relative to men. It has reduced the scope of employment relative to men. It has marginalized them in the economy. It has made their lives as housewives much more difficult.
Due to development strategies that are being chosen by the different countries that women are in this state of poverty, they are the ones which are the most hurt by the crisis. They are hurt by the cuts in social policy, and they are hurt by the fact that in terms of structural adjustment that there is unemployment, they have to go into the market and their wages are very low. So this pattern is very common.
So women have the double burden. Because of the sexual division of labor and because of this additional burden that women have, when you cut social services, you jeopardize women in three ways. First, when you cut social services, you're cutting jobs in which women predominate. Because when you cut health and education, it's mostly women's jobs that you're cutting. Secondly, therefore, you cut the incomes of women. And then you cut the services that women, because of the sexual division of labor and because of gender roles, it's women who use those services mostly. So when people get sick, it's women who have to take people to the hospitals and to the clinics. When people are being educated and you cut education services, it's women who then have to say, now, what is going to happen with the children when they cannot go to school?
A tendency that is present in Latin America and Caribbean, I don't know if it's present in Pacific, South Pacific, is the whole question of informalization of the labor markets and the precarization of the labor relations. Then I think that's important in the discussion to have these two levels, historical level of analysis, a more long terms and a more specific short-term analysis in order of not to impute everything to the crisis.
For example, some of us were talking yesterday that whenever we talked with Southeast Asian women about crisis, they would always turn around and say, crisis? What crisis? Who crisis? Which crisis are you talking about?
My approach to the whole topic was to try and integrate that together, because basically the crisis is gender specific in the sense that it has been women and their role within the household that prevented the slide into deeper poverty during the whole change in the country as a result of the crisis. And the gender aspect has never really been brought up before.
Entonces, dentro de los hogares, poder ver cómo estas relaciones entre los géneros son transformadas.
In the households, we can see how gender is affected by adjustment policies, how women and men are affected and how they react. Thinking about this leads me to emphasize the importance of how the sexual division of labor is a major key to the understanding of our society.
What we are trying to do this morning is to find a synthesis between the issues of women in the crisis and the work of the organizations. And what I discovered as I worked on these issues, on the impact of the crisis on women, what I discovered was that although the crisis appears to be to ignore women, in fact it is based and grounded on a gender ideology that assumes that you can exploit the time and labor of women. In fact, the crisis, the policies of structural adjustment, it seems to me, are actually grounded in the gender relations between men and women.
On one hand, as political feminists, we want to talk about concrete persons' lives, concrete women's lives. But gender is something much more than that. Gender is also a culture phenomena which is used by societies to integrate on various levels. So it's a sort of fluent, both material and immaterial resource, which has an economy of its own, which is to some extent specific in specific cultural and historical contexts.
The dramatic effects of structural adjustment policies and general impoverishment on women's lives has nevertheless functioned, in many circumstances, as an impulse towards change.
Y finalmente, es que las mujeres, como ya lo mencionaba, se han incorporado a nuevos campos de trabajo, ¿no?
And finally, women have been incorporated into new fields of work to fill positions left vacant by the absence of men. And because of the crisis in which we live with the war, which in effect demands a more active participation of women.
We got a lot of information from Africa as well as Caribbean about how women there are organizing and getting stronger as the crisis gets deeper. The women's movements are getting stronger and they are becoming much more challenging, they're becoming much more broad-based, and they are coming forward with their specific demands in this.
The women's movement in the region is still advancing, and as is the people's movement in the non-governmental sector. The one example I want to bring out is an association, an umbrella grouping in Jamaica, which was formed at the start of 1988, very, very tenuously. In Jamaica, we identified something like 120 women's organizations.
In this changing scenario, many dilemmas were recognized. One of them is related to the difficulties in articulating the specific approaches and actions of women's organizations and a broader understanding of the crisis.
I will turn to, in terms of the interlinks between the crisis and women's movements, there has been, as I see it, a tendency for the women's movements to focus still on particular issues and not to in fact make linkages between the crisis and their actions. Although, for instance, some of the women's groups have clearly linked domestic violence, escalating levels of domestic violence and violence in the community.
And we all felt that unless we had a strong women's movement which are aware of what's happening at the economy, at the macro level, we cannot really fight the kind of continuous erosions that are going to come on the whatever little gains we might have made out of development.
So that when I initiated this network, the first response from the women's movement was, it's so macro. It's another example of you researchers being at the top and telling us what to do. It doesn't affect our lives. But 3-4 years later, all of them are now so aware and are organizing around it.
But I think the state and the whole international system has also seized upon this great potential of the women's movement and is trying to co-opt, and it has, I think, succeeded in co-opting women. When we talk about democracy in the family, very often this is interpreted by offering concessions to middle-class women, by offering them quotas or by offering them allocations for improvements in the educational style and so on, which the questions address themselves only to middle-class demands rather than to working class or to the poor peasants.
The necessary mediation between the social universe, where changes are taking place, and the policy level of macro definitions has a clearly political dimension. In the Rio meeting, the evidence has stressed that for women activists and grassroots organizations, the building up of such links has not always been so easy.
Has feminism been successful in the extension of political voice to new actors? In other words, are the questions raised by women considered to be a legitimate part of the political debate of society? To have voice is to be heard. Not anyone is heard. And to have voice is the result of a political struggle. Has feminism been able to include new questions related to the uneven distribution of power among men and women, both in public and private space, into the voices of those to whom society accords legitimacy to be heard?
I would like to in fact give you some understanding of what is happening in India today in terms of political processes in women's movement. I understand that this political process takes place at 3 levels. The first is electoral level, the second is mass mobilization and mass organizations, and the third is autonomous women's groups. The left political parties have changed their attitude towards women's issues to some extent, but they have not been really incorporating the women's issues and the feminist theory into their own theory as such.
In Tanzania, 24% of the seats have been reserved for women. We have 6 women ministers, but what I want to draw, that is not enough, because it's not only enough to say we want women in political position, because if we just say that, we can end up with women like Margaret Thatcher.
Número considerável de mulheres que estão atuando politicamente. E eu até diria que estas mulheres foram eleitas porque a população...
A considerable number of women are politically active. I would even say that these women were elected because the population attributes them with the capacity to understand their basic needs. Because, obviously, if on one hand there's been a change in the image of women, on the other, there is still the traditional image of woman as a mother, as a person who understands and provides for the needs of the population.
What I'm saying is that trade unions and political parties then offer a vehicle for women to participate in and to bring the concerns that they can't bring through women's movements through those particular organisations, and it therefore points to the importance of interlinking with other social movements which are broader and which perhaps for reasons that they are protected by international solidarity from trade unions abroad, or for whatever reason, are in a position to more to tackle the state in a sort of more upfront confrontational way.
Nós mulheres não temos experiência.
We women have little political experience, so in the first place there is a need for this experience, and in the second place, women who do reach the power structure are isolated.
São isoladas.
Não significa necessariamente foi levantado.
It doesn't necessarily mean that a larger number of women as mayors, city councillors and legislators necessarily guarantee greater representation or participation. What I mean to say is their way of making policy decisions about basic popular services is not necessarily shaped by their links with social movements.
O grupo considera que precisamos encontrar.
We need to find strategies to join together the two levels, utopia and pragmatism. Political negotiation should be made, but without abandoning the dreams of utopia. We must try to outline feminist policies to propose to political parties. But most of all, the crucial point is still to think of the interaction between the state, the political parties and the social movements.
This reflection indicates that gender and crisis have both micro and macro dimensions, which must be politically articulated. However, such a task also appears to be requiring conceptual redefinitions, as well as renewed analytical frameworks.
Looking at the issues that Dawn has addressed, efforts have been made to introduce a macro level. This means everything about the understanding of the economy, debt, food production and the crisis. So I believe that if we really want to change the development vision and humanize this macro level, we must pay attention to the micro level, because what happens at the micro level changes the macro.
We should not only talk about this impersonal sphere, but that one has to think about the mediation of human agency. And from that point of view, there is this whole question of what is the reflection about the human nature in this kind of thinking. So if we are going to talk about politics, if we are going to talk about human agency, then we cannot talk only about impersonal forces, but we do have to think about human beings.
It was only recently that they have come up with gender-sensitive development at the macro level. I mean, the understanding that eventually, if you really want any long-term change, you have to try to break into the macro development structures and influence the whole policy formulation at that level. In other words, women no longer just can be the victim of certain processes, but we want to be the definers and the creators of processes that would allow a different system to come in.
Hemos tenido movimientos pendulares y hemos ido de esos
We have a movement like a pendulum. We have to swing away from those themes that appear to us as more important and more global and look at other questions that have also a vital importance. I think that this is the moment that the pendulum should swing from one side to the other and we should go to the other extreme.
Quiero decir que a veces el pensamiento y la investigación feministas
I want to say that sometimes thought and investigation are trapped by the use of certain categories that, from my point of view, impoverish more than they enrich the way that we see the world. For example, we have analyzed the difference between the public and the private in a schematic way, focusing on the micro and the private dimension and the public and the macro, without allowing ourselves to think about how behavior on this micro level is able to also have a macro representation and vice versa, how public matters have a micro representation.
Como en la cosa pública hay una dimensión micro.
¿Qué esperan las mujeres de los hombres?
What do women expect from men? What do men expect from women? How do they relate to each other in the family life? What does sexuality mean to women? What are women's fears about sexuality? And what are men's?
And I've talked about the differences only in terms of the world economy, but obviously, particularly in terms of the kinds of things that Nirmala was saying, the way in which women are enfolded within the household, the inheritance patterns, what the position of the girl child is, the marriage patterns, the sexual division of labor. And when the economy starts pulling you, transforming the household, those positions are making a big difference, I think.
Y mi impresión es que si nosotros
It's my impression that we've centered on a research program that focuses on the micro with a private reading and on the public with a macro reading, and we are lacking those important elements that will allow us to make the jump from the individual and private behavior of people to a wider agenda.
The emerging need to reformulate the concepts of Dawn's basic working schedule, gender, development and crisis, is converging with the particular dynamics of the 90s, when, in different spheres throughout the world, political and theoretical assumptions are being both changed and revised.
I feel that we are really lagging. That the world in 1990 is not what it was in 1985, and we are still talking in the language and the terms of 1985. We are living in 1990 in an age when ideology is dead or dying. There is no question about that. We have hung our hopes on socialism for years and years and years. That socialism to which we hung our hopes, it's a strap hanger that's broken. It's not there. We have to find a new language. We have to find perhaps a new vision.
I am not an expert. I don't have inside information, but I look at it with great optimism, not with pessimism. On the other hand, I think from the human point of view, I think it's remarkable. It's remarkable that societies can change in such an unpredictable way.
I don't think our analysis or framework of analysis has been radically changed or invalidated by what's going on in Eastern Europe. In fact, I think if anything, it's vindicating our framework of analysis. I celebrate, like with Carmen, what's happening there. I think it's a fantastic manifestation of people's revolt against authoritarianism.
But I think that because the world has changed, we should ask ourselves, in what direction has it changed? Has it changed in a direction that we could predict in 85, and therefore we have to continue the struggle? Or has what has happened in the last 5 years proved us wrong? I think it has proved us right, and I think that we have to continue to do our analysis, to sharpen it, to have a better understanding of the consequences of this kind of model on the lives of people.
Dawn's members reaffirmed the priority of researching alternative economic frameworks and decided on two new themes for analysis and action: women and the environment and reproductive rights. The subjects of research defined by the network will be explored and launched at local level. Contributors will gather again at a later date to share their experiences under a new leadership. The General Secretariat has now moved to Barbados in the Caribbean, and a new General Coordinator and Steering Committee have been elected.
Treadle, treadle, me long, long treadle. Shred a little needle with a long, long treadle. Treadle, treadle, me long, long treadle. Shred a little needle with a long, long treadle. Loose on, loose on.
The meeting was an opportunity for Dawn participants not only to evaluate their views, but also to define priorities and strategies for the future.